The last thing Waylon Jennings ever said to his best friend was a joke. And for the next 40 years, he would give anything, his fame, his money, his career, just to take it back. It was roughly 1 a.m. on the morning of February 3, 1959. The air outside the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa, was 14 degrees below zero. It wasn't just cold, it was a physical assault. The wind was howling off the frozen surface of the lake, stinging the faces of the musicians as they loaded their amplifiers into the back of a battered station wagon next to the tour bus. Buddy Holly, the 22-year-old genius of rock and roll, stood by the chain-link fence near the runway. He was frustrated. He was tired. He was dirty. He had been living on a school bus for weeks, washing his clothes in gas station sinks, and he had reached his breaking point. He had made a command decision. He was done with the bus. He had chartered a small Beechcraft Bonanza airplane to fly to the next tour stop in Fargo, North Dakota. He wanted to sleep in a warm bed. He wanted to do his laundry. He wanted to feel human again. He looked at Waylon Jennings, his 21-year-old bass player. Waylon was leaning against the frozen metal of the tour bus, shivering, dreading the 4-hour drive ahead through the dark, icy cornfields. Buddy knew that the roster had changed. He knew that Waylon had given up his seat on the plane to the big bopper, J.P. Richardson, who was suffering from a terrible flu. Buddy smiled, teasing his young protege. He wanted to get one last rise out of him. The relationship between Buddy and Waylon was built on this kind of brotherly ribbing. Two tough Texas kids trying to survive the brutality of the road with humor. "Well," Buddy said, grinning through the freezing darkness, "I hope your old bus freezes up again." Waylon laughed. It was a reflex. He looked back at Buddy, the man who had taught him how to play, the man who had bought him his first bass guitar, the man who was closer to him than a brother. And he delivered a comeback that was meant to be funny, a sarcastic jab. "Well," Waylon said, "I hope your old plane crashes." Those specific words, "I hope your old plane crashes," hung in the frozen air for a split second, then disappeared into the wind. Less than an hour later, the Beechcraft Bonanza slammed into a cornfield at 170 miles per hour. There were no survivors. For the rest of the world, that crash was the day the music died. It was a cultural tragedy to be mourned, analyzed, and eventually memorialized in songs like American Pie. But for Waylon Jennings, it wasn't a lyric. It was a life sentence. That single, sarcastic sentence would haunt him for the next 4 decades. It would drive him into a spiral of drug addiction. It would make him fight a war against the entire Nashville music establishment. And eventually, it would force him to create a sound so hard, so independent, and so defiant that it changed country music forever. This is not just the story of a plane crash. This is the story of the survivor. This is the forensic account of how the guilt of 1959 forged the outlaw of the 1970s. The music you know, the driving 4/4 beat of Lonesome, Ornery, and Mean, didn't start in a recording studio. It started here in the cold, with a coin toss, a seat swap, and a joke that went terribly, terribly wrong. To understand why the guilt burned so deep, we have to look past the logistics of the tour and look at the relationship. We know the winter dance party was a disaster of freezing buses and broken heaters. But for Waylon Jennings, that bus wasn't just a rolling refrigerator. It was a classroom. To really grasp the weight of the tragedy, you have to go back to Lubbock, Texas in 1958. At that time, Buddy Holly wasn't just a singer. He was the king of West Texas. He had already cracked the code. He had hits. He had been on the Ed Sullivan Show. For a kid growing up in the dust of Littlefield, Texas, Buddy Holly was proof that you could escape. Waylon Jennings was that kid. He was a high school dropout with a booming voice and a chip on his shoulder, working as a radio DJ at station KLLL. He was playing country records, dreaming of being a star, but he had no path. Buddy Holly gave him the path. Buddy frequented the station. He liked Waylon's voice. He liked his attitude. In 1958, Buddy decided to produce Waylon's first single, a track called Joel Blon. But more importantly, when Buddy decided to break away from his original band, the Crickets, he needed a new lieutenant for his upcoming winter tour. He didn't call the session pros in New York. He called Waylon. There was just one massive problem. Waylon Jennings didn't play the bass. He was a guitar picker. In a move that defines his character, Buddy didn't care about the technical skills. He cared about the man. He took Waylon to a music store in Lubbock. He pulled a brand new Fender Precision bass off the wall, a wildly expensive instrument for the time, and bought it for him. He bought him stage clothes. He told him, "You've got 2 weeks to learn the songs." This detail is critical. Buddy Holly was the architect of Waylon's entire career. He gave him the instrument, the job, the clothes, and the confidence. So, when they stepped onto that frozen school bus in January 1959, Waylon wasn't just a hired gun suffering through the cold. He was a student watching his hero crumble. The winter dance party has been documented as a logistical failure, but through Waylon's eyes, it was a tragedy of dignity. Waylon watched Buddy Holly, the man with #1 hits, washing his underwear in gas station sinks because there was no time for laundry. He watched Buddy trying to fix the bus heater with a screwdriver while his fingers were turning blue. He watched the glamour of the music business stripped away to reveal a brutal, exploitative machine. It broke something in Waylon to see his mentor treated this way. He saw firsthand that the promoters, the men in the warm offices in New York and Chicago, didn't care if the musicians froze to death, as long as they made the 8 p.m. curtain call. This shared suffering created a bond that went beyond friendship. They were soldiers in the same trench. They were the only 2 people on that bus who truly understood where they came from. By the time they reached Clear Lake, Iowa, the dynamic had shifted. Buddy was exhausted, but he was still looking out for his team. When he chartered the plane, his first instinct wasn't just to save himself, it was to save his band. He wanted Waylon and Tommy Alsup, the guitarist, to fly with him. He wanted his boys to have a warm bed and a clean shirt. That ticket was a gift. It was a reward for loyalty. And that is what makes the next moment so devastating. Waylon didn't lose that ticket. He gave it away. There is a persistent myth in music history that Waylon Jennings lost his seat on the plane in a coin toss. That is historically incorrect. While the movie La Bamba famously depicted the coin toss that put Ritchie Valens on the plane, Waylon Jennings was never part of that gamble. His story is far more painful because it wasn't about luck. It was about kindness. The coin toss did happen, but it didn't involve Waylon. It involved the third seat. Inside the crowded, chaotic dressing room of the Surf Ballroom, Ritchie Valens, the 17-year-old sensation, was begging for a spot on the plane. Ritchie had grown up in the warm San Fernando Valley of California. This Midwest cold was terrifying to him. He was shivering, miserable, and had never flown on a small aircraft. He approached Tommy Alsup, Buddy's guitar player. Tommy had a ticket. Ritchie wanted it. Tommy Alsup was a pragmatic Texan. He wasn't just going to give up a warm flight for nothing, so He pulled a 50-cent piece out of his pocket. They flipped the coin. Richie called heads. The coin hit the floor. It was heads. Richie yelled, "I won!" It was the first time in his life he had ever won anything significant. He won the seat. He won the right to die that night. But Waylon Jennings' story was different. His seat wasn't lost in a gamble. It was an act of charity. While Richie and Tommy were flipping coins, J.P. Richardson, the big bopper, was cornering Waylon. J.P. was a big man, over 200 pounds, and he was suffering from a terrible case of the flu. He was feverish, sweating, and coughing. The bus seats were too small for his frame. The thought of spending another 4 hours shivering in that metal box was genuinely terrifying to him. He looked at Waylon. "Waylon," the bopper said, his voice raspy, "I'm sick. I don't think I can make it on that bus. My size and this flu, it's killing me. Would you mind giving me your seat on the plane?" Waylon looked at the bopper. He saw a man who was physically suffering. Waylon was young, he was tough, and he was healthy. He didn't like the bus, but he knew he could survive it. Without hesitating, Waylon said, "Sure, JP, you take the plane. I'll take the bus." This distinction is vital. Waylon wasn't looking for a thrill. He was looking out for a friend. He traded a warm bed for a frozen seat out of pure kindness. He walked out to the loading dock to tell Buddy the news. Buddy was packing his gear. When Waylon told him that the bopper was taking his seat, Buddy smiled. He understood. But he couldn't resist the dynamic of their friendship, the teasing. "Well," Buddy said, grinning, "I hope your old bus freezes up again." It was a distinct possibility. The bus had frozen up 3 times already. Waylon smiled back. He leaned against the frozen metal doorframe, his breath pluming in the air. He searched for a comeback. He wanted to match Buddy's wit. "Well," Waylon said, "I hope your old plane crashes." It wasn't malice. It was the dark humor of the road. It was sarcasm born of exhaustion. Buddy laughed. Waylon laughed. Waylon grabbed his fender bass, turned around, and walked toward the bus. He didn't look back. He didn't know that he had just spoken the last words Buddy Holly would ever hear. At 12:55 a.m., the plane took off. Minutes later, it was gone. But on the ground, the timeline was agonizingly slow. Waylon Jennings spent the next 4 hours sitting in the dark of that school bus, and in a cruel twist of irony that would feel like a divine punishment later, Buddy's joke came true. The bus heater did freeze up. Just as Buddy had predicted, the heating unit failed on the drive to Moorhead. The bus became a rolling icebox, Waylon huddled in his coat, teeth chattering, miserable but alive. He spent those hours thinking about the warm hotel bed waiting for him in Fargo. He imagined Buddy, Richie, and the big bopper were already there, sleeping soundly. This period of ignorance is crucial to the trauma. For 4 hours, Waylon believed he had done a good deed. He believed he had helped a friend. He didn't know that his act of kindness was actually a death sentence for the bopper and a life sentence for himself. The bus finally arrived in Moorhead, Minnesota, early the next morning. The sun was up, casting a pale, cold light over the snow. They pulled into the hotel parking lot, exhausted. Waylon walked into the hotel lobby carrying his guitar case. He scanned the room, expecting to see Buddy holding court in the coffee shop. Instead, the lobby was silent. The hotel staff looked pale. People were whispering, looking at the musicians with expressions of pity and horror. The manager of the venue walked up to them. He didn't say, "There's been an accident." He didn't say, "Buddy is hurt." He looked at Waylon and said, "We need you to identify the bodies." Waylon's brain couldn't process the sentence. Bodies. The news had just come over the wire. The wreckage had been found in a cornfield just outside Clear Lake. The police needed someone to verify the identity of the victims. Buddy Holly's young wife, Maria Elena, was back in New York. They couldn't ask her. They needed Waylon. Waylon had to walk into the morgue. This is the moment where the history of rock and roll becomes a horror story. He had to stand over the broken body of the man who had been his mentor. He had to look at the face of the man he had joked with just hours before. He had to look at the leather wallet in Buddy's pocket, the glasses, the clothes he had worn on stage. And in that cold, antiseptic room, the words came rushing back like a physical blow. "I hope your old plane crashes." Those words didn't feel like a joke anymore. They felt like a prayer. They felt like a command. In the psychology of trauma, this is known as magical thinking, the irrational belief that your words caused an event. Intellectually, Waylon knew he didn't crash the plane. But emotionally? Emotionally, he had spoken a curse into existence. He had traded his life for the big boppers. He was alive because J.P. Richardson had the flu. He had stolen a future that belonged to someone else. If the story ended there, it would be a tragedy. But what happened next turns it into a nightmare. This is the part of the story that most people forget, but it is the part that destroyed Waylon Jennings. In today's world, if a major band suffers a catastrophic loss, think of Nirvana or Linkin Park, the tour is canceled immediately. Counselors are brought in. The world stops to grieve. But in 1959, the music industry was a brutal, mechanical beast. The promoters at General Artists Corporation looked at the calendar. They saw that they still had dates to play. They still had tickets sold in Moorhead, Sioux City, and beyond. They saw revenue. Unbelievably, the winter dance party did not stop. The bodies of Buddy, Richie, and the Big Bopper were still in the morgue in Iowa. But the survivors, Waylon Jennings, Tommy Allsup, and Dion, were told to get back on the bus. They had a show to play that very night in Moorhead. Can you imagine the psychological torture of that moment? Less than 24 hours after identifying his best friend's body, Waylon Jennings had to walk onto a stage at the Moorhead Armory. He had to pick up the Fender bass that Buddy Holly had bought him, the very symbol of their friendship, and he had to play the bass lines to Buddy's songs. Because they had no headliner, a local 15-year-old kid named Bobby V was recruited from the audience to sing Buddy's parts. Bobby V was actually buying a tie for the concert when he heard the news on the radio. He volunteered to fill in. Waylon stood there playing Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day, looking at the microphone stand where Buddy should be and seeing a terrified teenager instead. The audience was weeping. The promoters were counting the gate receipts, and Waylon was sinking deeper into a hole of rage and confusion. He later described this period as a fugue state. He was there physically, but his soul had checked out. Every night, for 2 more weeks, he had to perform a memorial service for the man he believed he had killed. This experience, the sheer callous brutality of the industry, planted a seed of deep cynicism in Waylon Jennings. He saw that the suits didn't care about the music or the people. They only cared about the contract. He realized then and there, you cannot trust the system. You can only trust yourself. For the next 10 years, Waylon Jennings didn't just play music. He ran from a ghost. He returned to Lubbock, Texas, expecting to grieve. Instead, he found a town that was confused and sometimes cruel. There were whispers in the local bars. He actually had people come up to him, strangers, and ask, "Why didn't you get on the plane? Why did Buddy have to die and you survive?" It was a question Waylon asked himself every time he looked in the mirror. To cope with the noise in his head, Waylon turned to a new kind of fuel. This led to his infamous wilderness years in Nashville, a period defined by roommates and addiction. In the mid-1960s, Waylon moved into an apartment in Nashville with another man who was fighting his own demons, Johnny Cash. Imagine that apartment. You have Waylon Jennings, carrying the guilt of the Buddy Holly crash. You have Johnny Cash, carrying the guilt of his brother Jack's death in a childhood saw accident. Two titans of music, living under one roof, bonding over their shared trauma and their shared addiction. Amphetamines became their survival mechanism. In the 1960s, uppers were the trucker's drug of choice, a way to keep driving through the night. Waylon started taking pills not to get high, but to keep the memories at bay. He wanted to stay moving. If he stopped, he had to think about the coin toss. If he slept, he had to dream about the cornfield. Musically, he was lost. Nashville in the 1960s was a factory. It was polished, polite, and controlled by producers like Chet Atkins. They put Waylon in a suit. They told him to trim his sideburns. They told him to sing sweet songs with string sections. They were trying to turn him into a gentleman. But Waylon Jennings wasn't a gentleman. He was a survivor of the winter dance party. He had frozen in a school bus. He had identified bodies in a morgue. He had played a show while his friend lay dead. The polished Nashville sound felt like a lie to him. It didn't have the pain. It didn't have the grit. He felt the spirit of Buddy Holly watching him. Remember, Buddy was the original rebel. Buddy produced his own records. Buddy wrote his own songs. Buddy wore glasses when the world told him to take them off. Waylon realized that by letting Nashville put him in a box, he was disrespecting the man who taught him to fight. He was wasting the extra time that J.P. Richardson had bought him. The outlaw country movement of the 1970s wasn't just a fashion statement. It wasn't just about long hair and leather jackets. It was a forensic reaction to the tragedy of 1959. It was Waylon Jennings finally deciding to stop running and start fighting. By 1972, Waylon had had enough. He was sick of the suits. He was sick of the producers. He negotiated a new contract that gave him something unprecedented in Nashville: creative control. He realized that life was too short to let a producer tell you what to play. He realized that if your best friend can die at 22, you better play every note like it's your last. He grew his hair out. He threw away the suits. And most importantly, he changed the sound. He demanded the right to use his own band, not the Nashville session players. He turned up the bass, the instrument Buddy had bought him. He added a heavy, driving rock and roll beat that sounded more like a Rolling Stones record than a George Jones record. This was the sound of the outlaw. It was the sound of a man who had stared death in the face and wasn't afraid of a record executive. Listen to a track like Lonesome, Ornery, and Mean, or Are You Sure Hank Done It This Way? That isn't just country music. That is survivor's music. The lyrics, the tempo, the aggression, it's all rooted in the trauma of that night in Clear Lake. When he sings about being crazy or wild, he isn't posturing. He is talking about the decade he spent trying to outrun the crash. Waylon eventually made peace with the memory. Years later, in a candid interview, he finally spoke about the curse and the joke. He said, "God, I've suffered over that. I've gone over it 1,000,000 times. But I know Buddy. I know he's up there saying, Don't worry about it, Hoss. It was just a joke. The crash took Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper. But in a strange, painful way, it gave us Waylon Jennings. It took the death of the innocent 50s to birth the rebellious 70s. The plane crash didn't just end an era, it forced the survivors to grow up, get tough, and create a sound that could carry the weight of the past. Waylon Jennings carried that weight for 40 years. And if you listen closely to the bass line of his greatest hits, you can still hear the heater on that frozen school bus rattling down the highway, carrying the man who was never supposed to be there. This is the history hiding inside the lyrics, the tragedies that changed the tempo of the world. If you want to keep exploring the brutal truths behind the greatest songs of our lifetime, hit that subscribe button. And remember, be careful what you say to your friends when you say goodbye. You never know if the wind is listening.